that the Premier's State of the State be considered and noted. The Honourable Member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to present my address in reply to the Premier's State of the State speech 2025. I've appreciated listening to the contributions of other members, and I acknowledge the final contribution made in this place by the leader of this nature, and I imagine that was quite a pleasant one to deliver. However, Mr President, I have found myself noting the common concerns that are being raised by a range of non-government members in this place, and my agreement with many of them. Indeed, I rise to make my contribution with some degree of disquiet and considerable disappointment. In a nutshell, the address delivered by the Premier in the other place on the 4th of March provides greater insight into the state of the Liberal government than it does into the state of Tasmania. Yeah. The paucity of imagination and constructive ideas presented is nothing less than alarming, Mr President. So much so that I found myself going back to the standing orders to ascertain what the convention and purpose behind this annual parliamentary address was intended to be. The address is in fact to provide an opportunity for the review of the government's past actions and proposed policies and activities for the future. In short, it's intended to provide for the government's legislative and policy agenda for the parliamentary year ahead. Yet, inexplicably, the State of State Address 2025 is devoid of any mention of a proactive legislative agenda. Instead, Mr President, we got a bizarre, limited, revisionist and reductionist statement, one that seemed to revel in the prospect of upsetting people. And that was in fact unashamedly divisive in tone and content. Yet, in its revisionist approach, it also, by default, acknowledged that much of the current bluster is intended to distract from the fact that it is becoming harder for this government to hide the extent to which it has wasted the last 11 years in power. The key announcements of privatisation and slashing the public service is couched with a revisionist and myopic attempt to blame others of 11 years ago and more. Yep. Enough already, Mr President, of the hiding behind a decade-old decision from former governments. The first step when claiming a commitment to accountability is accepting responsibility for one's own actions and decisions, especially when they extend back beyond a decade. Unfortunately, this government appears addicted to the lazy and base approach of blaming the parliamentary ghosts of historic parliaments past. Let's banish these political poltergeists and get on with examining the realities and the ramifications of this government's actions, or lack of, during the last 11 years of self-proclaimed mandates. Let's see a demonstration of real accountability by accepting responsibility for one's own actions. Mr President, I also consider the Premier's statement to not only be revisionist but also reductionist. Devoid of positive and progressive legislative agendas, it instead is a manifesto dedicated to dismantling. The confected moral panic over red tape, I think, is one such example of distraction via dismantling. In fact, it could be argued the announced efficiency units and red tape audits would suggest that maybe the position of Coordinator General is one of the non-essential public sector roles we should be looking at. That position has had years to identify and recommend unnecessary red tape for cutting. It is literally a core responsibility of the role, Mr President. And to be fair, it would appear that work in that role has progressed on this. The Tasmanian Red Tape Audit Report, released last year, states that since 2014, 86% of the 198 red tape issues identified have been addressed. So we have a red tape audit report process underway, being acted on, yet the Treasurer has just announced another red tape audit. Is it actually possible, Mr President, to create more red tape by duplicating your effort to tackle red tape? I wonder. Unnecessary duplication is a definition of red tape, as I understand it. This brings me, Mr President, to the bizarre announcement of putting parliamentary days aside to solely repeal legislation and regulation. It is fine to review and undertake a health check that our statutes are consistent with and meet contemporary standards and expectations. However, it is a simplistic and farcical notion that one new current piece of legislation or regulation equates to another existing piece of legislation to be repealed, particularly in the absence of any apparent maximum number of ideal total number of statutes. If it was as simple as a numbers game, then we'd have a sense of what the ideal total should be. The fact is that the total number of statutes is clearly arbitrary and ludicrous. So too then is the notion that trading an existing regulation for a new one is in any way a responsible manner of managing our statute books. And by the way, Mr President, the government needs to be reminded that it is up to each chamber to vote upon and agree on its sitting schedule. So while the Premier may put forward a proposal to designate certain parliamentary sitting days, it will be the Parliament which has the final say on that. Each chamber is a master of its own destiny. Not only do I consider unnecessary the sudden and frenzied moral panic about red tape, I must also take this opportunity, Mr President, to caution that the government must not attempt to treat this Parliament and its public scrutiny and accountability role as if it is red tape in itself. We have already seen that in action this week with an attack on the Parliament's appropriate scrutiny role, and it was incredibly disappointing to see both major parties so willing to undercut the responsibility of Parliament to scrutinise government and government entities on behalf of the Tasmanian people. Such attempts to undermine the primacy of parliamentary involvement and oversight is an attack on our fundamental democratic principles, Mr President. Mr President, mentioning Parliament brings me to an area where I do believe this government has missed a significant opportunity. The Premier and his government appear to have turned their back on opportunities presented by a potentially collaborative balance of power Parliament. Comment has been made over the fact that we've seen a range of good policy initiatives be proposed by a number of non-government party and crossbench members. They've been debated and passed across the Parliament in areas that will have a real impact on the day-to-day lives of many Tasmanians. In fact, we had an example just today in this place, Mr President. But if we were to look at in the State of the State address for more of these collaborative opportunities forthcoming, or indeed welcomed by the government, we would be left disappointed and empty-handed. The paucity of imagination in this address is breathtaking. The government is in a rut, it is moribund and devoid of constructive ideas. But it's worse than that, in fact, Mr President. In fact, this government has balked at and fled from the opportunity of the moment, back to its narrow ideological comfort zone of attacking the public sector and the services which vulnerable Tasmanians in particular, and so many more in our community, rely upon. Back to the comfort zone of playing wedging and division skittles. Back to the comfort zone of short-term and knee-jerk privatisation of public assets. In the context of tackling community disillusionment and fragmentation, the dangers of disinformation, the cost of living crisis, the climate justice challenge, the desperate need for financial structural reform, hiding in the comfort zone by a government is lazy. What we are witnessing is a government taking the easy way of trying to remain in power without putting in the hard work to earn the right to be in power. Yes, collaboration, reaching out across political differences to find common ground in the genuine public interest takes effort, determination and hard work. The opportunities of a balance of power Parliament offer a platform where that effort may pay off. It may deliver good policy outcomes initiated by a range of sources and therefore secure long-term support and implementation longevity. But instead, it appears the government is intent on bunkering down in its rule by division and fragmentation approach. The government is going to rely upon distraction rather than collaboration. It's going to desperately cling to blaming those who are mainly not even in this place anymore, rather than front up and take responsibility for wasting the last 11 years. Mr President, we heard much about a so-called pathway to surplus, which I will discuss in further detail later on. But what about a pathway which also develops and invests in our community capital and our biodiversity capital. When evaluating significant annual statements to Parliament, such as the State of the State addresses, I certainly seek to assess whether and how it delivers on core principles. And I ask myself questions like the following. Does this present a pathway to strengthen our vital democracy, a more robust integrity and transparency to strengthen public confidence in our systems of good governance? And I ask myself, does this present a pathway to all in the community to feel included and welcome to walk in an inclusive and equitable manner? And also, does this set out a pathway to structural fiscal reform, ensuring Tasmania is not only on a financial sustainable footing, but also an ecologically and socially sustainable footing in the immediate and long term? Mr President, on my estimation, this State of the State address comes up far short on all three of those questions. The current government has failed to seize this opportunity in time and has abandoned the space of constructive ideas. In the absence of a government providing leadership and vision, the rest of the Parliament now has an opportunity to reimagine a constructive platform laid out in an alternative State of the State address. Such an address would seek to deliver a legislative agenda driven by those core principles of strengthening democracy, good governance, integrity and transparency, and investing in a sustainable and cohesive community, backed up by a strong, structurally reformed Tasmanian financial environment. It's no surprise, Mr President, that I'm going to always have an eye in this place to strengthening the integrity of democracy in this state. An alternative State of the State address would have laid out a clear plan to turn back the tide that is currently eroding our precious democracy. This week, in this place, we saw a non-government amendment bill to lower the disclosure threshold and require more frequent disclosures pass our chamber and the Parliament, which was very welcome. However, more needs to be done to ensure a rigorous, transparent disclosure framework. Examples of that would be in our pathway to a strengthened democracy would include further reforms to state political donation disclosure laws, including the introduction of expenditure caps for the Assembly elections and or donations caps overall. Further reforms to the amount and distribution of public funding for the purposes of election campaigning and the disclosure administration system. An introduction to bans on political donations from corporate property developers, gaming and tobacco interests, and perhaps others. It would also have additional strengthening of our democratic legislative reforms that should include introducing truth in advertising laws to promote healthy democratic debate by prohibiting misleading or deceptive political advertising. A review, Mr President, of our Public Interest Disclosure Act 2002 with the aim of strengthening our whistleblower laws and protections which are shamefully deficient at the present time. An introduction even of fixed four-year terms for the lower house to encourage certainty and longer-term policy development while minimising the advantage that incumbent governments have in choosing an election date for partisan purposes. And also, one last to mention in this space, Mr President, moving to establish a joint parliamentary inquiry into a preferred model providing dedicated seats for the Tasmanian Aboriginal people in this Parliament. Something I hope to see one day for sure.
A recommendation of a parliamentary inquiry.
Indeed. Indeed, that recommendation pointed to the need to have a particular inquiry focused on dedicated seats, I believe, which we still have yet to see, probably close to a decade down the track. Mr President, crucially, as another pillar of strengthening our democracy, an alternative and constructive State of the State address would declare that attempts to undermine our planning system have been abandoned. No ifs, buts, and perhaps be reintroduced at a later date, just clearly abandoned. Such a commitment would reiterate the community's right to be included in land use planning processes and our right to merits-based appeals. It would commit to the state government getting out of the way of the local government and instead providing better support to that tier to do its job as planning authorities in accordance with the objectives laid out in our resource management planning system. The Premier's State of the State speech last week asserts the government has listened. It said that explicitly, the government has listened. Well, if that's the case, Mr President, we have to ask the obvious question, to who? If the government had genuinely listened, to the community, to all local councils in this state and to the majority vote of this chamber, then the DAPS bill should be scrapped once and for all, for example. The fact that the government is attempting to progress a strikingly similar bill to that which was rejected by this place in November last year is proof positive that it has absolutely no intention of listening to the Tasmanian people, nor those who represent them in the other level of government. Not only is the government not listening, it is determined to progress measures that block the Tasmanian people from planning processes which they have a fundamental democratic right to participate in, Mr President. Asserting that you are listening while at the same time trashing the opportunity for Tasmanians to have a say in shaping their communities through the planning system.
Point of order.
There is no quorum in the room.
Please ring the bells for lack of quorum. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Someone must have gone. Thank you. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr President. As I was saying, asserting that you are listening while at the same time trashing the opportunity for Tasmanians to have a say in shaping their communities through the planning system only proves that you are listening to and prioritising, in fact, special interests, vested interests, and not the Tasmanian people. Mr President, I move on to how we might better be delivering on the principles of robust integrity and transparency, an area of perpetual interest to me and one that I will unfailingly champion in this place. In a small, connected state like ours, we are highly vulnerable to situations of grey corruption in our decision-making and governance. This is nothing as overt as envelopes of cash passed under a table. Rather, it is often that more elusive relational influence brought to bear, which is all too readily normalised and then entrenched. Happily, there are clear mechanisms available to us to guard against the creep of grey corruption and relational influence in this state, and in the interests of delivering good governance and public confidence, we should be more actively pursuing them. A reimagined, constructive State of the State address would detail a pathway to investing in such measures, and they would include locking in through legislation the new lobbyist register and code of conduct as recommended by the Tasmanian Integrity Commission, a commitment to tackling the scourge of election pork barrelling by adopting the Integrity Commission's recommendations on reforms to grants administration for funding commitments, a plan to deliver on the promise for an updated review of the Integrity Commission to ensure it's fit for purpose and can meet public expectations. Starting with the Cox recommendations would be a good start, Mr President. We have a set of recommendations there from a review from now 9 years ago, which are waiting to be implemented and should be as a matter of urgency. Similarly, a comprehensive State of the State address would positively acknowledge the current RTI review underway and pledge to support and implement any findings and recommendations it may deliver. We could see a commitment by government to respect and act upon this chamber's call, made twice now, for the improvement of disclosure of ministerial diaries in terms of content and timeframes. And further, an alternative State of the State address would introduce a commitment to establish an independent police oversight body to ensure we move away from police investigating their own. Such a long overdue reform would both protect police officers from the perception of protecting their own, as well as boosting public confidence, particularly in light of scandals such as former officer Paul Reynolds, which has taken its toll on public confidence in our police force. And a final couple of aspirational things that I want to see in a positive state of the state address from government in terms of commitments to integrity, transparency and good governance would be these, Mr President. A commitment to trialling the release of cabinet documents after 30 days, as they do in New Zealand. That's good transparency right there. An announcement that from now on each piece of government legislation will have an accompanying regulatory statement released that details the need for the bill, the costs and benefits of options considered, the consultation undertaken and in its development, how the application of a gender lens and human rights lens was undertaken, and a rollout plan. Such a tool would promote transparency, accountability and evidence-based policy making for government bills. It would facilitate the functioning of this Parliament in passing legislation. And it is worth noting a similar mechanism, a statement of public interest, has been introduced into the New South Wales Parliament since 2022. Mr President, moving on to investing in an inclusive and resilient community. A key responsibility of government is to ensure that every Tasmanian feels and knows they matter, not just those who wear high-vis. A compassionate and people prioritising State of the State address would detail invest in core services of health, education and housing with a strategic future focus that delivers an improving trajectory on outcomes that can be demonstrated and shown for our people, not what we see now, which is the consistent and concerning downward trajectory that we see in each of those areas. It's not just about counting widgets, Mr President, and claiming annual record spending on things. It's about shifting outcomes for our community, something this government has consistently failed to do over the last 11 years. We see the well-being and cohesion of our community undermined by the constant reality of lack of access to these absolutely basic necessities of life, and now put further at risk by threatened cuts and public sector job losses. After 11 years of this government in charge of these fundamental pillars of government services for the Tasmanian community, we have made no enduring improvements in outcomes, and on many measures we've plummeted to worse and worse. Mr President, I'd also touch on other aspects of an inclusive and resilient community that we never hear from this government, but which I believe should belong in any State of the State address that genuinely values our Tasmanian community. Where is the plan to prioritise and progress the pathway to truth-telling and treaty? This has languished for far too long, Mr President. We need a sense of urgency and prioritisation from government that is currently simply not there. It is inexcusable for the government to be stalling on this front, shameful in fact, especially given our utter failure in meaningful progress on the Close the Gap measures. New data out just recently continuing to demonstrate that. There's no question in my mind, Mr President, that the portfolio responsibility for Aboriginal affairs rightly belongs with the Premier as a matter of leadership and an indication of genuine commitment from any government. This Premier is shirking this responsibility, which should rightly sit on his shoulders. I would also mention here the need to set a timeframe for what I have called for over many years in this place, a Tasmanian Human Rights Act, as called for twice by the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute and advocated for by many in our civil society and consistently by me in this place. Mr President, so much important work to be done that is being neglected by this tired, lacklustre government, so myopically focused on retaining power, yet with so little interest in governing. Nothing highlights this so much as this government's neglect of important oversight institutions and entities that we rely on to ensure the powers of the state are exercised with accountability. Where is the plan to address and implement the recommendations of the Tasmanian NPM Implementation Project report called Preventing Torture and Ill Treatment in Tasmania? And that was from November 2023. There was a subsequent update report in 2024 which presented us with a strategy and budget parameters to provide for progressive implementation of the TNPM to ensure that it's fully operational by the 2025-26 financial year. It is nothing less, Mr President, than cruelly cynical for this government in its last budget to have funded only the position of the TNPM but provided none of the requested funding for this position to do its actual legislated work, the inspection of places of detention to ensure cruel and to ensure torture and ill treatment are not occurring. So, Mr President, we have a TNPM on paper, but entirely unable to operate in practice. It is cruel, it is cynical, and it's wrong. We see a similar neglect in relation to other oversight functions and entities in our state, particularly those which provide an architecture to protect human rights, such as the Independent Office of the Custodial Inspector, which the government has also placed in the invidious position of having to warn that it is in danger of not being able to comply with its statutory requirements due to being starved of adequate resourcing. It is unacceptable and negligent for government to allow this to happen and then to turn a blind eye and allow it to drag on and on and on. Mr President, an inclusive and resilient community must also be a sustainable community that plans and equips itself to manage and mitigate environmental and community challenges it faces now and into the future. To that end, Mr President, I maintain we need to reinstate an explicit Minister for Climate Change and a commitment to the immediate development of a comprehensive climate justice plan for our state. And while we're talking about climate change, where was the update in this Premier's address on the implementation of the State Climate Change Action Plan 2023-25? This is particularly pertinent as the current plan expires this year in 2025, with a further 5-year plan to be developed apparently this year. An alternative and in-touch State of the State address would have detailed that plan process and provided the community and stakeholders with both incentives to engage with that process as well as provide a timeframe as to when to expect its commencement. Additionally, an in-touch and genuinely future-proofing State of the State address would provide an update on the implementation of the 16 recommendations contained in the much-awaited 2024 State of the Environment report that we had delivered last year.